All right, so this first one we got here, Will, we want to kind of update the weapon sales to Taiwan. This is something that we've really talked about since the first few episodes of Conflicts of Interest, and probably even late episodes of Foreign Policy Focus, which was the State Department is just dumping, uh, are now approving billions of dollars of weapon sales to Taiwan. So, Will, give us the update on these sales. What are we talking about here?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I figured it'd be good to start with the Taiwan thing because like we covered that on a recent show. We can just maybe update it. On that recent show, we talked about all these arms deals that were approved to Taiwan, which as people might recall, Taiwan, like the Chinese government considers Taiwan to be a rebellious province of China, and Taiwan, of course, considers itself to be its own country. So there's sort of an ongoing dispute and hostilities there. And the U.S. has been just, like you said, dumping weapons into the island, or at least approving them. And the particular sales that we discussed before included this like rocket artillery system, the HIMARS built by Lockheed, upgrades for their F-16s, and then these standoff cruise missiles built by Boeing. Um, However, at the time, we mentioned there were all these other weapons destined for Taiwan in various stages of approval in the arms export process. And since then, we have seen another one of these deals approved by the State Department. I think they approved 400 anti-ship missiles that'll to the tune of like 2.5 billion dollars, 2.4 billion, which are these are anti-ship missiles, obviously intended to be used against like a Chinese invasion of the island, should that ever happen. As unlikely as that might be, that is their obvious purpose. So we had that report that's been approved, but there's also other reports that there's other systems still in like the pipeline. Like I think they're also looking to buy Reaper drones from General Atomics, and also some sea mines to protect their coast. And that again is the idea would be to protect against a Chinese invasion. And all this stuff is added to like $15 billion in weapons that have already been sold to Taiwan just under Trump. And so there's been all kinds of these sales over the last few years, and especially just in the last few weeks, we've had like a wave of them. And in response to this, the Chinese have actually threatened to sanction American arms dealers that are making these sales. So in a recent statement, they named Boeing, Raytheon, and Lockheed, but they also suggested that like other companies they didn't name might also be hit as well. They might also sanction them as well. They have actually sanctioned Lockheed before, and that didn't seem to do much to deter any kind of future sales. I mean, we are seeing more now, so I kind of doubt that'll have like a real deterrent effect on them. But that has been the Chinese response, is to at least threaten sanctions. I'm not sure if they levied them yet. But that's just the first thing here. Like we have a real like series of stories to cover, but the arms sales I thought would be good just to update first. It looks like those are moving forward.
Yeah, well, I was actually kind of curious if the sanctions that China had imposed on the U.S. arms companies, because they do include like Boeing and Raytheon, if those could have any actual effects on any commerce between the U.S. and China, just because I'm sure Boeing buys a lot of like parts and components for their planes, and even looking at the civilian aircrafts from
Right.
different countries, and computer chips or anything like that may come, or China may be in the supply chain for some of these weapons. So, it may seem kind of like just a political move or a publicity move or something on China's part, but I could see, I guess, having some actual consequences or something like that. And just tensions that are unneeded. The U.S. doesn't need to be dumping all these arms on Taiwan. And then, something that me and you have talked about in the past is that a lot of times when these countries are buying arms, they're not only buying the weapons, they're also buying the U.S. security guarantee that comes along with it.
Right.
You become like a preferred U.S. ally, and then you start getting all these benefits, like, the U.S. says that we'll defend Taiwan no matter what, and if China invades, we'll send our entire fleet of ships over to make sure that nothing crosses the Taiwan Strait. You get that whenever you buy all these weapons, and then you kind of get the lobbyist feedback loop going for you, in the House and the Senate, and they're telling those guys, hey, you gotta keep selling the Taiwanese weapons, gotta keep approving and pushing these arms sales, and the money trickles into the think tanks and stuff like that, and then defending Taiwan just becomes more and more and more important. And that seems to be the direction we're going, because a lot of this, while the arms sales seems to be pushed by the Trump administration, it's been congressional legislation that has pushed for high level meetings between the U.S. and Taiwan, throughout Trump's
Right.
presidency. So there's a lot going on with that. Anything else on Taiwan, Will?
Yeah, just to add on what you said, I think there's some law that's been passed that actually like obligates the U.S. to provide like what they call defensive weaponry to the Taiwanese. And I mean, some of these weapons that we've been selling them, I think you could probably argue they're not fully defensive. That they could be, like standoff cruise missiles could probably be used for offense. But I guess that's their, under this like legal obligation that I don't know, they are obligated to sell what they call defensive weapons to the island.
It's like the quantitative military edge that we promised to the Israelis, where
Right.
we're like obligated to sell them different weapons and stuff like. It's absurd that somehow our foreign policy gets locked in that way. The only other thing I actually just remembered this, you had mentioned the potential Reaper sales drones to Taiwan, which would be interesting because I've seen in different cases these things just labeled like kind of as cruise missiles by different governments, feeling essentially they could carry out the same tactics of you strap any size bomb you want to the thing, and then you could fly it wherever and explode it. So
Right.
it could essentially be a cruise missile. And we know the Trump administration has taken steps to make it easier to sell these drones to foreign countries, and so I was just thinking that this is one of those cases where Congress had the ability to act, or people had the ability to act when Trump wanted to change the rules to allow these drone sales to more countries, and now we're, I think, kind of living with those consequences. But maybe we should move on to talk about what I think is one of the more interesting stories we have, Will, which is the U.S. is going to base Coast Guard cutters in the Western Pacific in response to China. And this headline just rings that Scott Horton saying that the U.S. treats the Pacific Ocean like a lake, and so since we're doing that, the western part of the Pacific Ocean, that's not California. That's not the American West. That's the area of the Pacific Ocean, like, that comes up to Japan and China and the Koreas and stuff like that. And this is where we're putting our Coast Guard. So what does that say just the way about we feel about the Pacific Ocean if we're putting our Coast Guard on the far side from it? And
Right.
the U.S. says that these are going in place as a security mission, which is going against illegal fishing and harassment of vessels, of U.S. vessels by China. So, I wasn't entirely sure of all the places these could be deployed. I know that there's been these kind of disputes around illegal fishing and harassment of vessels around the Philippines, where there's some disputed territories between the U.S. and China. But this seems like a real, first of all, area for conflict, potential conflict for the U.S. and China. And then again, just, the U.S. kind of imperial mindset here that, our Coast Guard is going, across the largest ocean in the world, and I guess pretending to defend the whole thing. So what you got on this one?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty far away from our coast if that's what they're supposed to be guarding. I don't know. Maybe it's someone else's coast they're guarding. I'm not sure. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't think they gave much details on this deployment. I don't think they said where they're going to be sending them exactly, or like how many are going to be deployed. But I know, in addition to all the stuff about fishing, I know the National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien said something about how this is going to counter China's so-called destabilizing and malign actions. So they're, that typical boilerplate language they use. But I mean, this is kind of in line. Like, there've been all kinds of U.S. military deployments around the East and South China Seas and in this broader region in China's backyard. A lot of which we've covered on this show. All the spy missions they've been flying in recent months, dozens and dozens of them. I think like 2 a day or something in September. And then they also regularly carry out these show of force and freedom of navigation missions around China, where they're sailing destroyers through the Taiwan Strait, or disputed island territory, or flying long-range bombers over the area, to show that we can. And so, sort of along those lines, we have this Coast Guard deployment last week, where they're saying they're going to send what they call fast response cutters to the Western Pacific. I think they also call them Sentinel class vessels. These are like medium-sized patrol ships, I think, but they're armed with like 50 caliber machine guns and autocannons. So at least we kind of know what they're sending, but we don't really know how many, and we don't exactly know where. But this is sort of like, in line with a lot of the other deployments we've been seeing in this region in the last, over the last year or so.
Right. Again, I think the problem is going to be that these ships end up going in places that are disputed territory between the U.S. and China.
Right.
I kind of refer back to what I was starting at the beginning of the show, where I think this policy will go whether you have a Trump or a Biden administration. Part of that, you mentioned all these show of force operations. A lot of that ramped up under the Obama administration with the pivot to Asia, and that seems to be a policy that Joe Biden is still very supportive of, and his campaign has been very hawkish against China. But moving on to a couple other stories we have here. Our Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, is making a trip to a bunch of different Southeast or Southern Asian countries. He's visiting the Maldives, Sri Lanka, India, Indonesia, and several others, but I know those are on his list the past couple days. And so when he went to the Maldives, he said that the U.S. has agreed to open an embassy there for the first time. This is I believe, an Indian Ocean country that's kind of south of India and Sri Lanka, a few islands, and has been a recipient of Chinese Belt and Road money. And so I think this is an effort to kind of combat that Chinese soft power there. And then this other headline we have is U.S. warns of threat posed by China. U.S. signs military pact with India, and it explains that the U.S. signed a pact to share satellite and map data with the government of India, and I guess it is at least what they say is to prevent the threat against China. Now, I mean, I don't know, Will, that they don't get into details and say that we're just going to give like the imagery along like the Himalayas, and so I'm curious if they're going to get like imagery of potentially what Pakistani positions or stuff like that, which is kind of an ally government of the U.S. but a very
Right.
enemy government of India. Or what about like the occupied Kashmir region? Are we going to help India with their occupation and oppression of the Kashmiris? So what you got on Pompeo's trip, Will?
Yeah, yeah. So Secretary of State and I think also the Defense Secretary joined him, Mark Esper. They went on this junket to India this week for I guess security talks, but it really was like a tour to promote the China threat to the Indians, where they're saying all this crap about how the U.S. will stand with India as they confront threats to their freedom and all this very dramatic stuff, obviously referring to Beijing. And as you said, while they were there, they signed this defense deal where they're going to share like military intelligence, specifically the satellite data, which, as far as I understand, is useful for like not only surveillance but like targeting purposes and stuff too. So like for missiles and drones and all that. And during that same visit, I think Esper also said we would start selling them more fighter jets. So maybe ways, like we're going to give them some of this intelligence and maybe give them weapons to use the intelligence with. Um, and all that stuff is happening. This whole like tour to push the Indians to be more hostile with the Chinese. That's all happening not too long after India and China got into this big scuffle over. I think you mentioned that their disputed border area along the Himalayas over the summer. That like flared up in June, I think, and there's actually a handful of soldiers that were killed on both sides. And like I think in May too, there was a similar flare up. So Sino-Indian relations are kind of at a low point right now, and it does seem like the U.S. is really trying to exploit that. We've seen them really like ramp up their rhetoric toward the Indians as it pertains to China. And the timing of this visit also kind of coincides with this big U.S. push to revive what they call the Quad Alliance, which we have covered on previous shows. But the idea there is basically to create this Asia-Pacific NATO alliance in order to counter China in the region. And right now that includes 4 members: the U.S., India, Australia, and Japan. But I think they've also talked about expanding it to South Korea and Vietnam and New Zealand as well. So they're really trying to build this like big anti-China bulwark in the Asia-Pacific region. And I think the 4 current members of the Quad just met in Tokyo earlier this month, which might bring us to our next topic here. But I'll let you jump in before I go on.
No, I think it's about all we have on this this part of the story. I mean, it's just again the U.S. is trying to go around, and I think when they went to at least when Pompeo went to Sri Lanka, the government there was I think pretty skeptical of his visit and kind of was like, we don't want to get caught. In between this, power struggle between the U.S. and China, Sri Lanka is definitely far more within China's sphere of interest than the U.S. one, and again is a recipient of the Belt and Road money. I think for a lot of their ports, and so I don't think they're really interested in the U.S. coming in and creating any problems for them. And I'm wondering just how many other countries feel the same way, because you talked about those Quad countries meeting, and the U.S. really pushed the other countries to sign on to a more aggressive statement, and China's bigger threat, and was unable to do so. And I think even this military pact with India, while it could be important, and again it could have geopolitical consequences with what maps of Pakistan are of Kashmir do they get, but at the same time I think they wanted more from India, and this was kind of all they were willing to sign on to. So that I think that's a part of this story too. But we can now move on to talk about some disputed territory between Japan and China, and a U.S. commander saying that troops can be sent to defend the Senkaku Islands. Will, did I pronounce that right? And tell us a little bit more about what's going on here.
Yeah, you're close. Senkaku Islands. But yeah, as all this stuff with Taiwan and India is going on, just this week, the U.S. also kicked off these major joint war games with Japan in the Pacific, which they do every 2 years, I think. And just as those were kicking off, yeah, we did have this commander, the commander of U.S. forces in Japan, Lieutenant General Kevin Schneider, saying that the war games that we're embarking on, they demonstrate how the U.S. could defend these disputed islands from a Chinese attack. Which I think we're technically bound to do by treaty anyway. I think we're like we have a mutual defense pact with the Japanese, but that kind of comment obviously can only like inflame tensions, and obviously was meant as a provocation for the Chinese. Even raising the idea that they would try to invade the island and saying the U.S. will get involved in that. However, the exercises they're doing this week are pretty major. They involve like 46,000 soldiers in total, I think, hundreds of aircraft, scores of warships, and they like do drills on land, sea, and air. So it's pretty like far-reaching exercises. And then one new thing I think they're doing this time is this cyber warfare component that they've never done before. So they're expanding these drills as well. And yeah, like similar to the Indians, like we're trying to push the India to be more hostile with the Chinese. Japan also has these territorial disputes with the Chinese. With India, it's a border thing, whereas with the Japanese, it's this island chain in the East China Sea, the Senkakus, which I think the Chinese know them as the Diaoyu Islands. And so there's this like long-running dispute over that. I think the Japanese have controlled those islands since like the late 1800s, but the Chinese say that their claim goes back to like the 1500s, and that it's like old, like very old territorial claim to this island chain. And the Chinese also say that Japan had agreed to give them back after World War II, which I'm not sure. I assume Japan disputes that they agreed to do that, but nonetheless they never did, and they now remain in Japanese control. And now we have the U.S. embarking on these war games, and the U.S. commander in Japan saying, "Yeah, we will defend the Japanese in their territorial dispute and take their side." So again, just another sort of similar push to one of our allies, and again another a member of the Quad alliance, but sort of emboldening them to be a little more aggressive toward the Chinese.
Yeah, you mentioned there the U.S. has a mutual defense pact with Japan, and I'm guessing there's a lot of people that will support that no matter what else. It's just one of those that like it's like a NATO country kind of, where we're gonna defend Japan. Japan's people would put like kind of a Western country or something like that, and like just fits into that kind of general world order of the U.S. and everything. However, you would think that the U.S. would at least say, like, you got some territorial disputes with your neighbors, and so at least in those cases, we're not going to commit to, defending your country or your claims there, because I think there's even disputes between Japan and Taiwan on these islands as well. I mean, I believe that Taiwanese still claim to be, or at least in some respects, the Chinese government in exile. So if
Right.
China has a territorial claim to something, Taiwan would as well. And also they have territorial disputes with Russia on islands going north of Japan. And I think there's even some at least water territorial disputes with South Korea, if not outright island disputes as well. And so it starts to get a lot more complicated when you think about if the U.S. would actually have to use military action. What would that look like, and who all gets involved here. It's not like Taiwan is just going to let the Japanese, I guess, claim the islands just because the U.S. says so. And I don't know, it could get real tricky and real messy. And it definitely seems like one of those things that'd be best for the U.S. just to stay out of.
Yeah, absolutely. Agreed.
All right. Well, one story here that I thought was interesting. I didn't have too much on it, but just a trend and something that we've talked about on the show, and I know you've covered quite a bit at RT, which is the U.S. is designating different Chinese, bodies or just agencies within the U.S. as foreign missions. Media companies have been rolled into this, but the latest announcement was by U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and that is the National Association of for China's Peaceful Unification was labeled as just an organization of the Chinese Communist Party, and again as a foreign mission, which I think means that there's different rules on the people who come within that foreign mission and stuff like that. The U.S. also withdrew from a local that I think is supposed to be like a city to city program. So the U.S. cooperates with like a Chinese city of a similar size or something like that, and it's like a cultural and diplomatic thing. I don't know if there's any real implications to the treaty being canceled other than a little bit less cultural exchange and stuff like that. But I did think it was worth noting that it seems the U.S. is looking for every opportunity possible to put more distance and more hostility between the U.S. and China. Well, I'm not sure if you had anything on that one, or if I should move on to the little bit of good news I had on the China front.
Yeah, I just had one. Like, I find it interesting that like this organization, I don't know much about it. The for China's peaceful reunification. I'm pretty sure what they're calling for though is like the reunification with Taiwan. I think that's like their whole thing. And I presumably the U.S. is saying that they're spreading the Chinese propaganda message about that. But I don't know. Like the name of it is peaceful unification. Like you'd think that'd be something they'd be before. They're always warning about China invading Taiwan, but no, you can't. You also can't talk about peaceful unification with it either, or else you're a foreign mission, I guess.
Right? It's either good Chinese propaganda, or maybe it's just the case of they're saying things and making points that the U.S. doesn't want them to make, so they're going to label them as foreign mission. So
Right.
the last story that at least I had to talk about in China, and Will, if you got something else you added, I don't know if I got all the headlines because there's been a lot of them. But this one was the one like kind of little bit of good news that I saw for all the reading I've been doing on U.S. China relations in the past couple of weeks, and that is China U.S. military chiefs hold crisis communications, says China Defense Ministry. And I guess the U.S. and China military chief talked this week about just setting up lines of communication and being able to try to de-escalate if something were to get a little bit more tense. And this is something that seemed to work fairly well in Syria. I mean, not that it was perfect, that there wasn't at least one case where the U.S. killed a whole bunch of Russian mercenaries. But overall, for having two superpowers operating all kinds of fighter planes over not a super large country in Syria, these decommunication lines seem to be effective in helping really any terrible tragic mistakes from happening. And so I'm hoping that the same thing happens here, as the US and China have all these disputed areas, mostly around China because the US treats the Pacific Ocean like a US lake. And so all those spy missions that you talked about, the two a day that the US was flying during September, and the show of force missions, all the extra weapons we're giving to Taiwan, wherever we end up deploying those Coast Guard cutters in the Western Pacific. Hopefully that if things start to get a little bit too tense, The generals can't get on the phone with each other, talk about what each other's country is doing in preventing the crisis from spiraling too much. Will, anything on this?
Yeah, I mean, that is like, one silver lining in this like flurry of really negative, stories that are really like, outlining this U.S. hostility campaign against the Chinese. And I'm not saying the Chinese themselves are like some great doves or, they're such great people or anything, or their government's so great. But certainly it does seem like the U.S. is sort of taking the initiative, pushing these hostilities. And so yeah, any kind of like deconfliction lines or anything that could like de-escalate tensions is a good thing. I mean, we've mentioned a couple times in the show. There was a couple months ago, I think in August, a U.S. spy plane flew over a closed military zone during a live fire naval drill, where Chinese aircraft carriers were like, doing live fire exercises, and that kind of thing could really, spiral. Like even just an accident in that kind of situation could really spiral into like a crazy, upward escalating hostilities between the two countries, maybe even a hot war. And so this type of like, these deconfliction lines are, anything like that we have is, certainly a good thing. And then I guess one last story that I would like to hit on here for the China roundup is all these hostilities. This is not just in our foreign policy. There's also like domestic efforts being made against the Chinese as well. Chinese companies, mostly tech firms, whether that's been Huawei, the telecom, or ByteDance, which owns TikTok, that app, and also Tencent is another Chinese company that owns the WeChat app. And most recently in the U.S., the Trump administration a couple months ago tried to ban both TikTok and WeChat, these Chinese apps, saying that they're a threat to national security and stealing our data and all this stuff. And those have both of those bans, the TikTok and WeChat bans, have faced a lot of legal challenges in U.S. courts. And the last thing that we have is like a handful of rulings from a series of different courts, basically saying that like the ban on TikTok and WeChat can't go through, at least not yet. Like as things stand, the court has not decided that this is legal. One court said that the WeChat ban is too broad and it would violate the free speech rights of the users of the app. And so there's a lot like these bans are kind of in legal limbo right now. But nonetheless, this is part of like this this campaign of hostilities against China. We're also doing it here in the U.S. against Chinese businesses, which of course the Chinese position is like that. The U.S. just doesn't want to compete with these Chinese firms, which there may be some truth to it. There also may be some truth that there are some privacy and data concerns with some of these companies. I certainly don't trust some of these firms with my data or whatever. But I feel the same way about Google and Facebook and all these other companies. And the Chinese government, they don't have police power over me. They can't tax or regulate me. So I guess I'm a little less concerned about those things. But nonetheless, this is part of this whole trend, I think, under like the Trump administration specifically. I think he's really overseen a massive escalation with Beijing in his 4 years in office. And it really is unfortunate because he's really setting up. We have an election in like 4 days here, and he's really setting things off on a bad foot for the next administration, whether that's him again or whether that's Biden, who, as you mentioned, is not really much better on China.
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't see any reason why a Biden administration would be any better on China, especially when looking at the rhetoric where at least Biden's Twitter account, has implied that the candidate believes that Trump has been too dovish on China. And,
Yeah.
this is the country with the largest population, the second largest military budget, a nuclear triad that's, definitely has the potential to wreak havoc on the U.S. should a war with China escalate. And so, we're not talking about just, a couple chess pieces here or a couple ships. This could be, nuclear warfare, civilization ending warfare that we're talking about here. And Biden and Trump are just playing around with it because that's what U.S. foreign policy is. And it's I think part of the problem is now is like the new like big honeypot in the Pentagon too, where all everybody just says China, and because there's so many Chinese people and that they're communists, and so that's very just easy scared. It's easy picking scare tactics, right? Like those are all the
Right.
buzzwords that people want to hear to dump hundreds of billions of dollars into like the military and stuff like that. And so, I recently read an article by Mark Perry at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, where he was explaining that the Marines are now drawing up different plans to combat China just because they need to get in on the China scam. So everybody's got get their little hands in the pot, and so even even the Marines, who Mark Perry notes are kind of notorious for not being super planful, and that, you know, it really doesn't make sense based on what the Marines are right now to reshape and reform in a way to combat China. But that's the plan, because that's how you get your money and funding and everything like that.
That's right. That's how you get the cash.
All right, well, let's take a second, stop talking about China, to thank our sponsor, Paloma Verde CBD. Well, how's the products treating you?
Yeah, our friends at Paloma were so kind to let us try a bunch of their products. They've got all kinds of stuff. They have the oil extract for CBD, which is the really packs the punch. That's the heaviest dose, if that's what you're looking for. They've got fruit chews that you can just eat to sort of titrate your dose. They've got salves and creams and stuff that you can rub on like sore joints and muscles, things for inflamed muscles. They also have these soft gels that I really like. I particularly prefer the ones with melatonin. That helps me, chill out and relax at night. But they also have one with curcumin, which has all kinds of, health benefits. And they even have stuff for your pets too. So they've got a real variety of stuff at Paloma. And if you want to see what they have to offer, or if you just want to know like what CBD is and what it can do for you, they've got all kinds of information there as well. Not to mention testing and lab data and stuff to really see that their stuff is legit, so you're getting what they say you're getting. So if any of that sounds like down your alley, if you're interested, check out palomaverdestore.com. That's PALOMAVERDE store.com, and use the promo code PEACE to get 25% of your order of over $75.